I killed the engine and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the rental car. My fingers locked around the steering wheel as if letting go might set something in motion I wasn't ready for. The drive up from the nearest town had been 25 miles of narrow road twisting through pine forest, so empty I hadn't seen another car since I'd turned off the highway. By the time I reached the clearing, my shoulders were tight, my jaw sore from clenching. The gravel drive ended here, in a half circle that overlooked the lake. Beyond it, the lodge waited. From the lawyer's photographs, I'd expected something rustic and maybe a little charming. A summer retreat gone to seed, the sort of place families might rent for fishing trips. What I found instead was a structure that looked less like a home and more like a bunker. The house stood right at the edge of the cliff, its timber walls stained dark from weather, its roof patched with tin. The stone chimney leaned slightly, scarred with soot, but the windows were what struck me first. Not panes of glass glinting in the late afternoon sun, but heavy shutters bolted tight, sealing the place from within. The doors were reinforced steel set into frames too thick for a cabin, and at the north side, crouched low against the foundation, was an iron hatch so heavy I could see the rivets from the car. It wasn't a lodge, it was a fortress. The pines around the clearing groaned in the wind, branches scraping against one another with dry, wooden sides. No voices, no motors, no evidence that anyone else had been here in a very long time. The silence was immense, the kind that made you realize how much noise human life usually generates. I forced myself to move. Gravel crunched under my boots as I opened the trunk and pulled out my duffel bag and laptop case. The cold hit my skin in a way that felt sharper than weather should be, carrying with it the smell of water like water, but not clean or fresh. This was heavier, darker, edged with the sour tang of algae and something metallic, like rusted pipes. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at what was now my long mine. All I had to do was live here for 1 year. That was the condition. 1 year of continuous residence. The lawyer had been very clear. If you leave before the term ends, Mr. Miller, the property reverts to the estate. Those were your uncle's exact instructions. I'd nodded then, half distracted, more interested in the fact that I just inherited real estate worth more than anything I'd ever owned. But now, standing in the clearing with the house looming against the sky, the words pressed harder. Why a year? Why not simply hand it over? I didn't have an answer, and I didn't like that I was already second-guessing myself. The porch steps sagged under my weight but held. The boards were gray with age, the kind of color wood takes on after decades of rain and sun, but solid enough. The brass key slid into the lock like it had been waiting for me all along, the tumblers clicking with soft finality. When the door swung open, a breath of air drifted out. Not the must of long neglect, but something cooler, wetter, as though stone walls had been sweating in the dark. Inside, the lodge was larger than I expected. The living room stretched wide, anchored by a stone fireplace that could have swallowed a man whole. The furniture was heavy oak, scuffed but sturdy, as if chosen for durability over comfort. Windows lined the far wall, but everyone was sealed behind thick shutters. The only light came from the gray spill of day through the open door. I stepped inside and set my bag down. The floor creaked faintly beneath me, then went still. Houses talk if you give them time. They creak and settle, they sigh in the wind, they whisper in the pipes. This one said nothing. I walked through it anyway. The kitchen was tucked off the main room, narrow but functional, with a refrigerator that hummed faintly and a stove whose enamel had chipped away to metal. Dust filmed the counters, though someone had made an effort to keep things in order. Upstairs I found 3 bedrooms, each stark and empty except for mattresses wrapped in stiff plastic. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub stained gray with mineral lines. Everything about the place spoke of utility, not comfort. It was all ordinary enough until I found the hatch. At the end of the kitchen hallway, the floor gave way to reinforced concrete. Set into it was the iron hatch I'd seen from outside, a massive circle of metal inset with a wheel lock and 3 keyholes. The surface was slick with condensation, beads of water sliding down to gather at the edges. I tried the keys. None of them fit. The wheel lock wouldn't budge. I crouched lower, running my fingers along the seam, and the chill shot into my skin like contact with ice. Every instinct told me to leave it alone. I backed away. The wind rattled the shutters then, making the whole house quiver like it had teeth chattering. I left the hatch behind and returned to the living room, telling myself it was just a basement, just storage. But I couldn't shake the sense that the house was more cage than shelter. And then I saw the tower. Through one of the narrow side windows, half visible through the pines, a rusted shape rose. At first I thought it was a power line, but as I stepped outside onto the porch again, I realized what it was: a radio tower. It rose 30 feet, skeletal steel braced against the wind, topped by a dish permanently angled toward the water. I followed the cables that trailed down from it across the clearing to a squat outbuilding set back among the trees. The door was secured with a padlock that had long since rusted, the wood around it swollen and soft. I pressed against one board and saw into the dim interior. Shelves of radio equipment lined the walls, dials and knobs, spools of wire, an ancient transmitter whose casing was flaked with corrosion. A microphone hung from a cord so frayed I thought it might snap. Dust blanketed everything. And yet, every piece of equipment was aimed in the same direction as the dish outside, toward the endless black lake. The water stretched to the horizon, still and cold. No boats disturbed its surface. No voices carried over. It might have been bottomless for all I could tell. I stood there with the smell of algae and rust thick in my nose, listening to the silence, and wondered what my uncle had been listening for. The lawyer's words returned again, softer this time, like a voice remembered in a dream. Your uncle was a private man. He left specific instructions. 1 year, no exceptions. A year inside this house. A year with shutters bolted shut, with doors meant to withstand assault, with a basement hatch locked like a vault, and a radio tower aimed at the water. Why? I didn't know. But as the sky darkened and the first stars crept through the tree line, I felt the weight of the year ahead pressing down on me. It didn't feel like a gift anymore. It felt like a sentence. The first night in the lodge was a lesson in what silence can do to a mind. I thought the city had taught me to sleep through anything. Sirens, neighbors yelling, the endless boil of traffic. But quiet made a different kind of noise. It pressed at the shutters, pooled in the corners, waited in the hall like a shape just beyond the reach of light. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the master bedroom mattress, still wrapped in its crinkling plastic, and lay on my back listening to the building breathe. It didn't. Sometime after midnight, the cold pushed deeper. The air had that slickness I associated with basement stairwells and old stone churches. I told myself it was just the lake, that big animal gliding its body of water up against the cliff, cooling the ground from underneath. I shut my eyes and tried to count breaths. 3:03 a.m. I didn't see the clock. I felt the number. It arrived like a pinch in the eardrum, pressure shift. air tightening, a prickle at the roots of my hair, and then a sound rose through the house that wasn't quite a sound, a smear of static dragging its sleeve along every wall. I held my breath. Nothing moved in the bedroom. The shutters didn't rattle, no footsteps. The static thinned, gathered itself into a thinner wire and began to hum. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was exact. From somewhere out on the property, a transmitter was picking its way across the band like fingers feeling for a pulse. The radio tower. I was up and lacing my boots before I gave myself time to talk myself out of it. The hallway smelled faintly wet. I told myself it was in my head, the way smells are on nights you can't sleep. Down the stairs, through the living room with the dark fireplace like a mouth without teeth, and out the front door. The wind had died. It felt as if the pines had leaned closer to listen. The tower stood over the outbuilding like a thin metal spine. At its top, the dish looked frozen in a posture of attention. Cheek lifted, gaze fixed on the black plain of the lake. The hum was true now, unmistakable. A soft electrical throb that didn't come from the lodge or the outbuilding or the sky. It came from the angle where the dish pointed. I walked to the shack, palms tingling, and pressed my ear to the gap between two boards. Cold dust and mouse droppings and an old smell like hot electronics after rain. The hum lived in my skull now, not louder, just nearer, like a date approaching on a calendar. It wasn't a tone exactly. It had grains in it, scratches. I realized I was hearing more than a frequency. I was hearing movement inside the frequency, the way you can tell talk radio from jazz just by the shape of the noise through a closed door. I went back inside because there was nothing else to do. At 3:04, the pressure eased. The hum thinned to nothing. The house loosened just a fraction. I stood in the kitchen without turning on a light, palms on the counter, breathing slowly until my hands stopped shaking. When I finally dragged myself upstairs, the clock beside the bed said 3:07. I slept for maybe 2 hours before a dream jerked me upright. Rushing water, a thing like a bridge made of ribs, and I lay in the gray of early morning, letting the room resolve around me. The smell hit me first, like water left in a bucket in a warm room. Not brine. Not rot, just that iron-laced flatness that says this has been still too long. Downstairs, the kitchen light hit a field of dust motes, making them look like a galaxy I could walk through. The sink was dry. The taps were dry. The window by the sink was bolted shut. I turned to set the kettle on and stopped. Between the kitchen and the narrow hall that led to the iron hatch, the wood had been cut. 9 marks, parallel and precise, 4 inches long, carved cleanly through the grain at a slight downward angle. The shavings lay piled along the baseboard like curled fingernails. The wood revealed by the cuts was pale and fresh, a bright wound in the darker timber and wet. I reached out before I could stop myself and touched one. My fingertip came away shining. I sniffed my finger and tasted metal and silt. It wasn't possible. The house was sealed. I had locked the door behind me. The shutters were bolted from inside, but the shavings on the floor were damp, and when I crouched and pressed 2 fingers to them, cold bled into my skin as if they had just come out of a lake. I took a picture. Then I took 10 more from different angles, as if angles mattered, as if that would change the feeling that I had woken up inside a problem that didn't care whether I understood it. 9 marks. Why 9? I didn't touch the iron hatch. I didn't want to be near it. I made coffee and drank it standing up. I washed the cup, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, and realized there were only 2 cups in the entire kitchen. I tried to remember if that was true last night. I couldn't. At 10, I drove into town. The trees shook off last night's stillness and flicked at the car with their shadows. The road unspooled in that way only upstate roads do, a ribbon of broken yellow line through green that has been green for centuries. The lake fell away and returned, as if the land hadn't quite decided whether to let it go. I took the first right at the first traffic light and ended up on the town's main street, which was also probably its only street. Brick storefronts, a barber pole that might have been older than me, a diner with a sign that read Rita's in chipped paint, a hardware store with a window full of rakes and snow shovels, even though it was months till first snow. I parked in front of the hardware store because that was what people do when they don't know what else to do. The bell over the door announced me to a room that smelled like oil and old wood. The man behind the counter had the thick wrists of someone who lifts things for a living and a jaw that looked carved with a dull tool. He wore a flannel that had been washed into softness and a name tag that said Clyde. Morning, he said, like the word could be either welcome or warning depending on what came next. Morning, I said. I just inherited the place up by Cold Spine Point. Something flickered behind his eyes. He smoothed it away quickly and reached under the counter for a pad of paper. What do you need? I don't know. The honesty surprised me. A pry bar, flashlight, batteries. Maybe a dehumidifier. Do those work in old houses? They work, he said, but his pencil hovered. You staying long? A year, I said, because telling the truth felt like stepping into a cold lake in one brave step. Condition of the will. Huh, he said. He wrote down PRYBAR, lead flashlight, D batteries, dehumidifier in a blocky hand and shook his head once like at a thought he didn't like. Problem. He looked up at me in a way that made me feel like I'd been weighed. You'll want screws too. Weatherproof. Those shutters will chatter in the wind. They're bolted. You'll want more, he said, and pulled a box from a shelf. Lot of weather out that way. He didn't ask my name. I didn't offer. When he rang me up, he said, You hear it yet? Sorry. He tapped the side of his head as if adjusting a hearing aid. Out there, after midnight, like someone trying to tune to you. I didn't realize my mouth had gone dry until I tried to swallow. I heard something. Clive slid the box of batteries closer to me and lowered his voice just enough that the sound didn't have to cross the entire store. My advice, don't talk to it. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. To the radio tower, he didn't laugh. To whatever thinks you're the tower. When I pushed out into the light, my shadow looked unfamiliar. I told myself it was because the sun here had a different angle. At the curb, I turned back. Clive had returned to the job of being a man in a small town hardware store. If I had imagined the warning, it was an elaborate hallucination that involved the exact way the pencil had stopped over the order pad and the specific shape of the word don't. I had planned to try the library. The building was just down the street, an old brick schoolhouse with a new aluminum ramp out front and a banner advertising Story Time Thursdays. Inside, the air held the dry, comfortable smell of paper and carpet cleaning. The woman behind the desk had white hair cut into a circle around her head like a halo you could switch on and off. Her name tag read Evelyn. She looked up and smiled with professional cheer that had survived long winters. Hi there, she said. You look like you need a map, coffee, or folklore. Folklore, I said, and her smile tilted. Try me. I told her the minimum amount. A lodge up on Cold Spine Point, an uncle's will, a radio tower aimed at the water. I left out 3:03 a.m. and the 9 wet marks because I wanted to see what she said without help. Evelyn folded her hands. "The point's old," she said. "People in town used to call it Fathom's End. Bad name for tourism. We don't use it now." "Why?" She considered the way librarians do when they are deciding whether to give you what you ask for or what you need. "During the war, first one, a man built a transmission shed out there. Said he was listening for foreign radio. He stayed after the armistice, kept listening. Later another man took it over. People say they traded off like monks with a bell. Every few decades it got passed to somebody else." "Passed how?" "Somebody dies," she said, not unkindly. "And then someone else arrives who doesn't mind being alone." I didn't like how easy it was to fit my shape into that sentence. "You have archives?" I asked. She pointed me to a room with a microfilm reader and a stack of bound local papers that stopped in the 90s. I hauled a stack to a table and lost 2 hours in the moth-eaten march of time. Prize pumpkins, fishing tournaments, letters to the editor about potholes and kids these days. Every so often, a note from the point. Equipment delivered, no trespassing signs replaced. Man missing after walking near point at night drunk. Found 2 days later, alive and embarrassed. Then a photograph from 1978. A man stood in front of a truck with a wooden crate in the back, squinting at the camera. The caption read, "Local researcher receives naval surplus." The man was thin and serious, hair slicked flat as if to keep thoughts from escaping. Behind the truck, the shadow of the tower fell across the road in a long, thin blade. Evelyn touched my shoulder. I didn't hear her approach. "Lunch," she said. "We close an hour. Would you like me to pull property records for the lodge when I'm back?" "Yes," I said too quickly. "Thank you." "Be careful, dear," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. On the walk back to the car, I counted storefronts that looked like the past had been repainted over and over. People have a way of pretending that nothing terrible happens where they eat tuna melts. It's one of our better skills. I drove out of town with the dehumidifier whining in the back seat like a small animal, and told myself the lake was just water and the tower was just rust. When I reached the lodge, the quiet had arranged itself differently. The pines stood with a patience that made me feel like I was late. Clouds had unrolled across the top of the lake, ironing it into a skin. I carried the dehumidifier inside and plugged it in the kitchen. The fan spun up and pushed a ribbon of air that smelled like hot plastic. I went to the place where the 9 cuts had been encrouched. The shavings were still there, damp as if a hand had spritzed them an hour ago. The cuts themselves had dried to the color of toasted bread. But when I pressed a fingertip into the lowest one, water beaded up from the wood, a clear dome that clung for a second and then slid down the groove. The air tasted faintly of iron again, the way pennies do when you've handled too many. I went looking for the utility panel. I found it in a closet off the hall, behind an old canvas coat that smelled like rain. While I was there, I checked the closet's top shelf for no reason, except that closed places make you check them. My hand touched a cardboard edge. I pulled down a box the size of 2 shoeboxes taped together. The tape had lost all stick. The lid lifted in a slow sigh and revealed notebooks. 7 of them, identical, black covers scuffed to gray at the corners. An inch-thick rubber band had died across their bellies, leaving a pale mark. I carried them to the table and sat. The first notebook opened to a page with my uncle's name written in small, precise letters, and a date from 12 years ago. The handwriting after that was neat, almost mechanical. Observations of weather, notes on maintenance, list of deliveries, screws, gaskets, solvent. Then a sentence that felt like a splinter under the skin. 3:03 a.m. Low band activity. Pattern. I turned the page. Drawings of waves that were not waves but boxes of oscillation, neat and careful. Another entry, 9 marks on southern doorframe. Wet shavings, salt content anomalous for freshwater body. Investigate. He'd drawn the marks to scale. My throat tightened. Further in, the neatness jittered. Lines sloped up. Letters leaned into one another like people in a photo at the end of a party. Knot, wave, knot, noise. A page later, it calls by measuring. I feel it thinking in edges. He had begun to count between the hum's pulses, writing numbers so small they looked like grains. There were equations I couldn't follow, sketched coils and antennas, and a little drawing of the tower dish with arrows that all pointed to the water. He wrote turned toward me, and then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. The 4th notebook had smears on it I told myself were coffee. The handwriting in that one was different and not different, like someone had practiced, until the shape of the letters was right but couldn't quite disguise the rhythm. The way a person can wear your clothes and not wear your walk. I closed the notebook. The house had cooled while I read. I hadn't realized I'd been sweating until the air on my neck felt like cold breath. I put both hands flat on the table and told myself I would not look at the hatch, and then looked at the hatch. Condensation stubbled its surface. I could hear the dehumidifier's little fan, and beneath it, another sound that was like silence. Remember, the tower, asleep in daylight, a machine holding its breath. I set an alarm for 2:50 a.m. There are hours that feel like you invent them by setting an alarm. The lodge changed after midnight, softening, its corners going rounder, the spaces between boards sifting out little threads of cold. I made coffee and didn't drink it. The clock said 2:58, and then it said 3:01, and then it seemed to think about staying there. At 3:02, the air pressed inward like a hand. At 3:03, the hum arrived. It came through the walls like a tide that didn't care whether walls existed. The tower gathered the night and poured it through a keyhole. The hum had layers, an older tone so low it made my teeth feel loose, a higher wash like a fingernail moving along a pane, and something in the middle that was almost voice. I walked to the door without remembering the part where you decide to walk to a door. On the porch, the night stood up around me. The lake wasn't black anymore. It was a sheet of graphite holding the shape of the wind. The dish at the top of the tower pointed so steadily, it made my own posture seem sloppy. The hum thickened and thinned, and then a thread lifted out of it like a hair rising from static, and I heard my name. I didn't believe it. I stood absolutely still and did not blink, and the thread lifted again, and there it was, unmistakable, spoken in a voice that lived in my skull and not in the air. Miller. If I had been wiser or more afraid or less curious, I would have gone back inside and shut the door and put my hands over my ears. I took one step toward the tower. "Don't talk to it," Clive had said, and I understood now that he hadn't meant don't hear it. The hum leaned the way people lean toward you when they are trying to show they are harmless. The night felt like standing in front of a refrigerator door that a child keeps opening. My mouth tasted like pennies again. I said nothing. The thread lifted a third time and said my name with a sound just wrong enough that my mind had to sand it to fit, like a mirror with a breath on it. When the pressure changed, it wasn't in the air but in me. The hair on my arm settled. The hum thinned. The thread snapped. The dark loosened itself and threw back the ordinary noises it had been hoarding. A tree rubbing another tree, a far owl pretending to be a question. 304, I thought again without looking, and went inside because there was nowhere else to go. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I walked through the house like someone checking a wound under a bandage. In the hall by the hatch, new shavings had drifted into the night. 9 marks, parallel and clean, cut deeper this time, a shade nearer to the floor, as if precision had improved with practice. Water beaded along the grooves and slid down, pooling on the concrete lip of the hatch. When I reached toward the wet, the cold jumped up and took my finger in its teeth. I hissed and stuck the fingertip in my mouth and tasted the lake. I backed away and put the notebooks back in the box and put the box back on the shelf in the closet, because rituals are how we convince ourselves we have any control at all. I told myself I would go back to the library when it opened. I told myself I would not say anything to Evelyn that would make me sound like the kind of person who hears his name in the static. I told myself a lot of things that sounded like plans and felt like superstition. Standing at the sink, looking at my reflection in the dark square of a shuttered window, I understood why the lodge had been built like a bunker. It wasn't to keep anyone out. It was to give you something to push against while something measured you. The box of notebooks didn't stay on the closet shelf for long. By the second night, I had dragged it back to the kitchen table, set the dehumidifier humming in the corner like a nervous pet, and spread the journals across the wood in a neat line. 7 of them. The rubber band that once bound them lay in a brittle coil, as if it had given up its duty years before. I told myself I would only skim them, that I'd look for practical information, notes about repairs, delivery contacts, anything that explained why my uncle had locked this place down like a bunker. But the first page pulled me in, neat handwriting, the kind of script they don't teach anymore, all sharp loops and straight stems. The date at the top, May 3, 12 years ago, day 1. The lodge is intact, supplies arrived as scheduled, the view is perfect. A man could vanish here if he wanted to, and maybe that's the point. The early entries were ordered, weather notes, measurements of humidity, barometric pressure, water temperature taken from the cliff's edge. He cataloged the condition of the shutters, the basement hatch, even the tower equipment. None of it was remarkable except for the precision. Each note was clipped, scientific, stripped of emotion. It read like someone making a case to himself for why living alone was not only possible, but preferable. But then came an entry circled in red ink. Day 42. Transmission activity at 3:03 a.m. Frequency low, below ordinary band. Sustained for 58 seconds, repeating pulses. Recorded as 9-9-9. I glanced instinctively toward the hallway where damp wood shavings still lay scattered around the frame. 9 gouges, precise and parallel. My stomach nodded. The next entry was shorter. Day 43. Same time, same sequence. 9 again. He'd drawn the marks in the margin, small slashes in groups of 9. Underneath he wrote, not random, measurement, counting. I flipped ahead. The pattern continued. Each night he noted the transmission, always at 3:03, always with the number 9 attached somehow. Sometimes it was 9 pulses, sometimes 9 minutes of sustained static, sometimes 9 shapes carved into the wood inside the house. My hands itched as if I'd already touched the grooves waiting for me in the morning. By notebook 2, the handwriting had changed. Still neat, but there was tension in the letters, a jitter at the edges like a hand held too long against strain. Month 3. The marks are deeper now. Door frames, windowsills, the stair rail. always 9, always wet. They are not intrusions, they are measurements. Something outside is keeping track of me. I stopped there, staring at the page until the words blurred. My coffee had gone cold beside me, the surface trembling slightly with the vibration of the dehumidifier. The idea that the cuts were measurements made of me for me sat in my head like a splinter I couldn't pull. The entries grew longer as the months rolled on. His focus shifted from house maintenance to the nightly phenomenon. The journals filled with diagrams of oscillation, frequency ranges, the tower dish sketched over and over from different angles. Notes on the lake itself, its depth, its currents, its chemical composition. Month 6. Transmission grows clearer. Not wave, not weather, pattern. Human-like cadence, but not language I know. I feel it aligning to me. I feel it learning my edges. The word edges appeared again and again, sometimes underlined, sometimes written 3 or 4 times in a row, the ink pressed so hard it bled through the page. One entry stopped me cold. Month 8. Saw figure on water at 3:03. Pale glow beneath surface. Shape too long for man, too upright for fish. When the hum ended, the scratches appeared in the bathroom door. 9 again. I think it wanted me to see them. I rubbed my eyes, realizing I'd been leaning forward so long my shoulders had cramped. The silence in the lodge had thickened with the coming night. The pines pressed close outside. I checked my phone. 10:15. I should have gone upstairs. Instead, I opened notebook 3. The handwriting here was barely legible. Letters looped into each other, ink smudged by what might have been water or sweat. The entries became more like confessions than notes. Year 2. I cannot sleep. The hum arrives whether I wake for it or not. I feel it moving through me, not around me. My dreams are no longer mine. Another page, year 3. It is not communicating, it is copying. Every scratch is a measurement, every pulse is calibration. It is drawing me, line by line, in some place I cannot see. I turned the page and nearly dropped the book. The entire sheet was filled with a charcoal rubbing of a human outline. Shoulders, arms, torso, all the same proportions as my own. Underneath, written in jagged strokes, my measurements. The air in the kitchen felt too thick to swallow. I closed the book, but there were 4 more. Notebook 4 began differently. The handwriting had steadied again, almost unnaturally so. Neater than before, too neat. Year 4, the process continues. The tower aligns correctly now. I have adjusted the dish myself to ensure accuracy. I no longer resist the measurements. I understand their purpose. The tone was wrong, detached, clinical, without the fear that had bled through the earlier pages. It sounded like someone reporting progress to a superior. Entry after entry followed, each stranger than the last. Year 5. The scratches appear on schedule, moisture levels increasing. This is expected. Year 6. Voice transmissions clearer. Cadence matches my own speech patterns. Year 7. The copying process is successful. Original no longer required. I shut the notebook hard enough to stir dust from the table. That handwriting had been my uncle's, but not. Too controlled, too exact, like someone or something was practicing. The remaining journals lay in their box like a row of traps. I couldn't bring myself to open them yet. The air in the kitchen tasted damp again. The hum hadn't started, but it was as if the house remembered it, carrying the residue of those frequencies. I poured the cold coffee down the sink and turned off the light. That night, I didn't set an alarm. I told myself I wouldn't look, but when my eyes snapped open, the clock on my phone glowed 2:59. My body already knew. At 3:03, the air pressed in. The hum came low and certain, threading itself through the walls, the floors, my own ribs. I lay rigid in the dark, ears straining, trying to hear beyond hearing. And then faint, distorted, buried in static, I heard my name. Not shouted, not even spoken. Just carried like a current sliding beneath a larger wave. My skin crawled. I gripped the mattress, nails digging through the plastic wrap, and whispered into the room, no. The hum didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because when I went downstairs in the morning, the wall by the kitchen had changed. 9 new gouges deeper than before. And this time they weren't just parallel lines. They curved slightly at the ends, bending together into the beginnings of a shape. A human shape. My height. My build. The outline of me. The outline on the kitchen wall haunted the rest of the day like an afterimage. Every time I blinked, it hovered behind my eyes. 9 cuts bending into a shoulder, a neck, the hint of an arm reaching toward the iron hatch as if the wall had learned to want something. I scrubbed the floor, swept the damp shavings into a bag, and set the dehumidifier to its highest setting until its small fan sounded angry. The air stayed wet anyway, as if the lodge exhaled from its bones. By noon, the sky had lowered to a lid. Wind came in long, slow pulls that never quite arrived at the gust they promised. I tried to read, paced, tried to nap, paced, ate bread directly from the bag and called it lunch. By 4, I had moved the notebooks back to the table against my better judgment and opened them to prove they couldn't surprise me anymore. They could. Notebook 5, one of the 2 neat ones, contained a single line that wouldn't stop breathing in my head. The tower aligns correctly now. The dish had looked rusted into position, a permanent gesture toward the lake. But if my uncle, or whatever finished his sentences, had aligned it, maybe it could be moved. Maybe there was a way to refuse the angle, the nightly geometry that pointed at me and then through me, and then into that water. I didn't let myself think too far ahead. If I believed, even for a breath, that I could fix anything, I might discover how wrong I was in a way I couldn't come back from. At dusk, the trees filled with birds that talked all at once and then, as if someone had pinched the sound between finger and thumb, went quiet. The quiet had a weight. I felt it settle on the roof. I felt it rest on my shoulders. I didn't start coughing. I didn't pace. I stood in the doorway to the hall and looked at the iron hatch until I could think around my pulse. Condensation had beaded into new constellations and ran in cold lines to the lip. When I pressed my palm to the metal, it took the heat from my hand so completely it felt like theft. I set an alarm for 2:50, but knew I wouldn't need it. Sleep had turned into a narrow ditch I might fall into by accident. Even there, the static followed. I lay on the plastic-wrapped mattress, clothed and booted, listening for the minute hand to scrape toward what it wanted. Time did its slow work. The lodge rounded its corners again. The pines breathed. The lake, whether I could hear it or not, held itself like the breath you take before speaking. 2:59. The phone's light made the room look underwater. 3:02. Pressure the same as always, but truer, like a friend placing a hand on your chest and pressing steadily until your lungs understand who is in charge. 3:03. The house became an instrument. The hum wasn't loud. It rarely was. That night it wore a different coat, a low cord braided with a glassy thread, and beneath both, the almost voice that had learned my name. I felt it in the mattress, a very slight tremor like a truck passing blocks away. The shutters didn't rattle, but I could have sworn the screws remembered how. I stood. The world had that held breath clarity of snow about to fall, even though the night outside the window was only a colder version of itself. Each movement felt both chosen and inevitable. I walked downstairs, past the place where my outline had begun, past the hatch that drank heat. I did not stop there. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The tower did not look different. It never did. 30 feet of rusted spine with a listening face, tilted to the lake as if waiting for a single word. The hum thinned and lifted a narrow thread from its own body. The thread stroked the air and shaped itself around a syllable, Miller. There was something in the way it said it that night, a practice run no longer practice. It hit the vowel right. The last time it had been as if the word had been poured into a mold that didn't fit. Now the mold had been filed, warmed, flexed. It sat on my bones. I took a step toward the outbuilding. The padlock on the warped door had rusted into decoration years ago. I wedged my shoulder against the wood, and the board gave it a softness that felt like a rotten tooth coming out clean. Dust sprang up, tasting like pennies again. Inside, the equipment slept in their coats of oxidation and lint. A switch waited under my palm with that invitation all switches have, no matter how long they've been dead. "This is a bad idea," I said aloud, and the room did nothing with the words. I pushed the switch anyway. Nothing happened, or rather nothing happened in the shack. The hum outside leaned. I heard a single dry pop at the top of the tower, as if a bubble had burst inside the dish. The thread in the hum tightened. The air in the shack felt suddenly smaller. Somewhere between caution and compulsion, I climbed the tower. My hands found holds in a ladder that had not resigned itself to rust. The metal was cold enough that it chose what my fingers felt. 10 feet, 15. The hum ran along the steel into my arms. The dish greeted me, a gray ear rimed with flakes. Up close, it was bigger than it looked from the ground, and the bolts that held its angle were bigger too, but not impossible. Someone had sprayed them at some point with lubricant that had petrified into amber. I braced myself and pulled. Nothing. The bolts were statues. I tried again, feeling a slow heat of embarrassment rise even though no one watched. I told myself I would climb down, go back inside, and pretend the impulse had been a test I'd passed by failing. Then the dish shifted, a half millimeter. I felt it more than saw it, a click in the wrist of the machine. "Don't," I whispered to the dish or to myself, I wasn't sure. I strained. The second bolt answered the first with a complaining creak. I put my shoulder against the rim and turned as if I were moving furniture in a room that had already decided where furniture went. The dish came a degree toward me, then another. It took a long time to draw the angle off the lake. Each fraction felt like dragging a barge with a rope wound through my teeth. The hum changed imperceptibly as I worked, like a choir that had found the exact center of a note and refused to leave it. When the dish finally pointed away from the water, away from that, and toward the trees, the hum didn't stop. It braided itself tighter. The thread spelled my name twice perfectly. I didn't feel victorious. I felt seen. Climbing down, my boots rang small alarms on the rungs. The air near the ground had cooled further, as if the tower had spent its warmth learning me. I closed the shack out of reflex and walked back to the lodge without looking at the lake because I understood something about stairs and answers. Inside, the kitchen ticked. Not a clock, but little expansions, and shrinks you only hear after you've been listening to the wrong thing for too long. I stood in the doorway to the hall and knew, before I lifted the flashlight, what I would find. The outline on the wall had completed its shoulder and most of its arm. The 9 gouges that made it were so clean they looked lacquered. At the elbow, they began to splay like fingers. The hand, my hand, was turned palm out toward the iron hatch as if asking for the wheel. Water glistened in every groove and ran down into the seam around the metal. Another 9 marks had appeared on the opposite wall, mirrored, as though the thing practicing needed both left and right. The hum didn't live out at the tower anymore. It was in the hall. It was in the hatch. The house had become a throat, shaping the sound until it meant what it was going to mean. I set the flashlight on the floor and aimed its beam at the hatch. The light shook a little. I told myself it was the floorboards under my feet, the small human tremors that confirm you are not a tripod. The wheel on the hatch glistened from condensation. I touched it with one finger and found, somehow, the exact cold of a doorknob on a winter morning when you were a child and wore no gloves because you believed you were proof against weather. I went to the utility closet for the pry bar. The metal felt warmer than the hatch because everything did. I came back and wedged it under the wheel, not because I believed I could move the wheel, but because doing nothing had begun to feel like participating. The bar bit against the seam. I leaned. The hatch grunted, a sound too deep to be sound, more like a statement a house makes in its sleep. The wheel twitched. Rust powdered the rim. I leaned again and heard the old sigh of bolts, remembering they were supposed to move. The first quarter turn took the breath out of me like exertion does when you've forgotten your blood has a job. The second quarter turn came easier, and by the third, the wheel was no longer something I turned. It used me to turn. When the wheel reached vertical, it stopped with a thud that felt preordained. I didn't want to know what came after vertical. I leaned anyway. There was resistance, and then there wasn't. The hatch unsealed with a kiss like suction breaking. Cold air rushed up from below with a sigh that belonged to the oldest basement you've ever known and the first grave you can imagine. The flashlight beam slid across wet stone steps. They were older than the house. They were older than lumber. Water filmed them, running not down but toward me, a trick of slope that had chosen to become a rule. I listened for the sound of dripping and heard instead the constant quiet of water moving in confidence. The smell lifted the hairs in my nose. Iron and leaf rot braided with the hospital clean note of something distilled too many times. I should have waited for daylight. I should have called someone, anyone, just to say a human word into the air. I placed my foot on the first step. Water puckered around the leather. My second foot found the next step by memory. The hum had no origin now. It was in the stone. The stairs delivered me to a platform the size of a dining room table, and then continued down, taking the flashlight beam with them into a depth it made no sense to have under a house. The water met me at the top of my boots and decided it liked my shins. The walls, if walls were what they were, rose on either side, too far apart for a basement, too close for anything else. My light strobed across them and caught what I had not prepared myself to see, even though the notebooks had made preparation possible. Figures, hundreds of them, then more than hundreds, each incised into stone with the same 9-cut precision, each my height, my reach, my strange posture when I'm listening for a sound in another room. The grooves glistened as if freshly cut. Water wept from their edges. Some were so old the edges had rounded to kindness. Others had the rude sharpness of a new idea. Every figure reached toward the place where the stairs bent out of sight, toward what my light could not yet reveal. The 9 marks at each figure's shoulder and wrist were signatures, a way of saying measurements were taken here. I told myself to breathe in a way that didn't sound like pleading. The water reached my knees, then my thighs. I had not taken more steps. The water had decided. It moved toward the stairs, not down them, streaming past me with the grace of something practicing to be a river. Miller. The lake said through the stone, and my name did not echo. It landed. I lifted the light. The beam wavered. 50 feet ahead, where the stairs vanished into a wrong geometry, the water bulged. Not like a wave, like a thing remembering its shape. The hum gathered behind my sternum. The bulge rose higher, then broke. A head came first, impossible and familiar at once. Hair in the mess I'd left it when I dragged a hand through it. A face arranged to match mine in a mirror that had learned to be kind. The eyes were wrong, too clear, the whites the color of old glass. Water streamed from them steadily as tears no body would have left to chance. The mouth had found my shape, but not my warmth. Salt water, or what a different world would call salt, spilled from its lips in a thread that never ended. A neck, shoulders, the shirt I wore, in a version that had been remembered rather than woven. The thing rose with the care of a person standing in a nearly full bathtub blindfolded. When it reached the depth that made breath matter, it didn't breathe. It made no sound. It watched me with my eyes and the patience of weather. I didn't step back because there was nowhere to go that wasn't water and stone and the house drafting you into its floor plan. I said, no, because speech is a reflex in the presence of mirrors. The thing tilted its head in a gesture I knew, because I had made it at photographs of myself. When I was trying to decide which version of my face belonged to a resume. It lifted its hand and water ran from its fingers in sheets that rewrote the notion of dripping. In its palm lay a set of brass keys whose teeth had never been designed to fit anything human. They shone with the kind of polished friction gives to metal used daily by a creature with all the time it needs. You move the dish, it said in my voice perfected. Even the break at the edges of sentences where my breath stumbles on old high school asthma was there. That was instructive. The wrongness in it wasn't accent or pitch. It was the way the words had a little distance between them, like tiles set with a spacer. My knees remembered how to shake. What are you? It didn't answer immediately. It looked past me at the stairs, then past me again at the hatch rim where water pooled, then back into my eyes like a doctor taking a measurement he already knows the result of. It's late, it said. You must be tired. Something in the stone behind it sighed with relief as if the script had reached a reassuring line. The water climbed my ribs without splashing. It tugged, not hard, the way a current that loves you does. The flashlight's beam swam. Don't, I said, to the water or to the thing or to my own feet, I wasn't sure. I lifted the pry bar like a weapon a person would lift because you are supposed to lift weapons. The thing didn't flinch. The water liked my waist now. The figures on the walls reached calmly for the place where the stairs bent the wrong way. You came, it said. That was all that was required. I didn't have a choice, I said, and hated the way the sentence made something in the stone nod. You had every kind of choice, it said. You chose interestingly. The hum deepened. I felt the dish's new angle as an ache under the hum, a decision the tower would live with. Perhaps an accommodation had been made. Perhaps it didn't matter. The thing lifted the keys as if to show me how weight works. I don't want this, I said, and meant the house, the water, the year, the way my name felt when said by a mouth that used it like a tool. It doesn't matter, it said gently, clinically, practicing my gentleness and my clinical. We are very close. The water touched the bottom of my ribs and warmer air gave up and went somewhere else. I thought of the librarians of the tower, the men in photographs whose faces should have been warnings and had been, apparently, advertisements. I thought of Clive's pencil hovering over his pad. I thought of Evelyn's "be careful" with its careful edges. The thing took one step forward and did not displace the water. It carried the surface with it the way a ship carries a metal sea in a dry dock. Why not? I asked, because buying time is built into speech, and the number had lived in my mouth for nights. It considered, and the consideration was me thinking. 9 gives us you, it said, and I understood nothing and everything in the way you understand a smell from childhood. The hum swelled, and the house heaved its small sigh as pressures equalized. Behind me, above me, the wheel of the hatch moved one notch all by itself, as if turned from the other side. I didn't turn to look. The thing watched me not like prey or partner, but like a measurement tool taking calibration from a known gauge. The keys didn't jingle. Water kept them from making the world smaller with sound. "Please," I said, and the word embarrassed me not because it was pleading, but because it assumed a correspondence that the thing had not promised. It did not answer. It lifted one hand and touched its own chest where water never stopped exiting, an endless, narrow river that rode itself down its ribs. "Soon," it said. "Not now. Now we practice." The water reached my sternum. My arms floated of their own accord, the pry bar light as a reed. My body less my own body and more a suggestion the water accepted or didn't. The flashlight rolled in my palm and sprayed the beam across 100 versions of my outline, each reaching toward the bend in the stairs where the geometry gave up and became purpose. The thread in the hum said my name again. Not calling exactly, completing. The thing turned its head a fraction toward the hatch, then back to me, and smiled a smile I recognized from photographs where I was trying to make someone else comfortable. "Tomorrow," it said, as if we had made plans. The water pressed its cold coin to my heart. I couldn't feel the floor, the light hiccuped. I tried to store the way the room looked against the moment it went dark, and that was when the house, having learned enough for one night, released the pressure by the smallest degree, like a doctor loosening a tourniquet. The hum thinned. The thread fell back into the braid. The water stopped rising, not retreating, not relenting, stopping, like a teacher closing a book to mark the end of a lesson. The thing lowered the keys to its side. It did not sink. It did not advance. It watched me with a patience that made patience look violent. I backed up a step that might as well have been a wish. My heel found a stair, then another. The water skinned my chest as if trying to memorize the exact temperature shared between us. When I reached the platform, the flashlight found a steadier hand. The thing did not follow. It didn't need to. It had learned what it came to learn, and I had learned that learning is not a neutral act. At the top of the steps, the hatch waited with its wheels set to vertical like a clock hand laid where it wanted to rest. The kitchen was colder than the basement. The outline on the wall had sprouted the last curve it needed to be unmistakable. The palm reached the hatch, a fingertip kissing iron. Water ran from that carved fingertip as if a spring had found a map. I put both hands on the wheel and turned. It accepted my help with the indifference of a mechanism that believes it could have done it alone. The seal kissed shut. Air equalized. The hum withdrew to the tower and to the lake and to the inside of my bones. On the table, the notebooks waited in their row. I dried my hands and opened the one that had no right to exist, the too neat one, and found on its last page a line I had missed. "When the dish no longer needs the water to find the town, the year will be short." I closed the book. Upstairs, the plastic crinkled when I lay down on the mattress. The sound was absurd. The ceiling waited with its blank face. I could feel the lake deciding how long to breathe before speaking. Tomorrow had already been scheduled in a voice that used my cadence. And yet the house, for the smallest of moments, felt like a place a person might live. Not because it was safe, but because there is a human talent for arranging terror into a list. I made a list in my head. Call Evelyn, go to the library, ask for property maps, bring Clive coffee, pretend to buy screws, count the gouges, do not speak to the thread, do not look at the lake when it says my name, sleep if possible. At 3:13, the last of the hum bled away like color from a bruise. By dawn, the outline on the wall had dried to the color of old bones, and the floor under the hatch had puddled into a shape I did not want to recognize as a footprint. The tower, when I stepped outside, still faced the trees. The lake, behind my back, practiced my name. Morning came gray, the kind of gray that doesn't brighten but spreads itself thin until everything looks like it has been erased. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold before I'd taken 2 sips, staring at the lake because pretending to look away seemed worse. It was calm, too calm. Its surface stretched like the skin of an eye. The tower loomed beside me, its dish still angled toward the trees where I had left it. That small defiance should have felt like victory, but instead it gnawed at me, like I'd only taught it a new angle to measure from. Inside, the house smelled stronger than ever. Not just damp, not just algae, but the sour, sweet stench of low tide left to rot. The outline carved into the wall had dried, the grooves pale and sharp as bone, but the floor beneath it was slick. Water had pooled overnight into a shallow film that hadn't been there before. I tried to work with the notebooks again, flipping through diagrams and entries written in that too-perfect hand. The copying process is nearly complete. Original no longer required. The line repeated, again and again, as if the writer had needed to practice even that sentence. By noon, I couldn't sit still. I drove into town thinking human voices might break the spell. But the faces at the diner, at the hardware store, even at the gas station all carried the same expression, recognition without warmth. People looked at me and then looked away like they knew me already and didn't like what I'd become. Evelyn at the library pulled out the property files I'd asked for. She spread them across the desk without a word. Dates, transfers, names of men who had come before me. All solitary, all without family, all disappearing after exactly 1 year. Their signatures scrawled across the deeds, legally sound but uncanny in their sameness. They all looked like you, she said finally, her voice low. Everyone, some more than others, same height, same build, same edges. The word edges made my skin crawl. I asked the only question left in me. What happens if I leave before the year's done? She shut the folder carefully as if closing a wound. It waits, and then it finds another. I drove back with her words beating against my skull. If I left, someone else would inherit the trap. If I stayed, the trap would finish what it started. By sunset, the smell of seawater had soaked into everything. Clothes, sheets, even my skin. The dehumidifier whined uselessly. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong, like the glass had been taught my face by someone else. My eyes seemed too pale, my mouth too deliberate. I told myself I would stay awake, that I'd meet 3:03 armed with coffee, notebooks, and defiance. But fatigue is a predator. It knows when to strike. My eyes closed sometime afterward. When I woke, the house was silent but full, like something held its breath inside the walls. The clock read 3:02. Then it came. Not a hum this time, not the braided static of nights before. This was voice, clear and exact, speaking my name with my cadence, my breath, my pauses. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the hall. The outline on the wall was complete now. A perfect silhouette of me, arm outstretched, hand pressed flat against the iron hatch. Water poured steadily from its carved fingers, streaming down into a pool that spread across the floor. The wheel on the hatch was turning, slowly, steadily, all by itself. "No," I whispered, and my own voice answered from below. The hatch swung open, releasing a flood of air so cold it took the words out of my lungs. I stumbled back as water surged up the stone steps, carrying with it the stink of brine and rock. And then it came rising through the black flood with a calmness that made panic obscene. Me. Same height, same build, same scar through the eyebrow. My clothes, soaked through but identical. My voice, when it spoke, was mine down to the nervous rasp. "You've done well," it said. "All the measurements are complete. The year is satisfied." It carried the brass keys in one hand, glistening, as water streamed endlessly from its hair, its eyes, its mouth. Every drop it shed found its way into the spreading pool at our feet, as if the house itself were thirsty for it. I raised the pry bar like a weapon, but my double only tilted its head, amused at the theater. "You'll drown in here," said. "You already have," it answered. And the way it said it, flat and certain, made my chest tighten as if the water had already filled me. The pool rose to my knees, then my thighs, pulling at me with a current that belonged to an ocean far below the cliff. The carved silhouettes on the walls glistened, their arms reaching toward us, toward it. The double stepped closer, moving with a precision that was more learned than lived. Its smile was mine, perfected. "The process is complete," it said. "Tomorrow the paperwork will be signed. Ownership confirmed. The cycle continues." I staggered back, water sloshing, the flashlight beam jerking across its pale, clouded eyes. "What happens to me?" I demanded. It leaned forward, close enough that drops from its hair struck my cheek, salt burning into my skin. "You join the collection." And then it smiled wider, a smile stretched too carefully across a face that had once been mine. The water surged higher. My feet lost purchase. The current dragged me toward the open hatch, toward the tunnel that breathed the sickly green light I'd glimpsed through the telescope. The carved figures blurred in the beam of my failing flashlight. I struck at the double with the pry bar, but it caught the swing too easily, hand closing around the steel with a grip that belonged to me but stronger. It twisted, and the bar slipped free. "You've been very helpful," it said, and its voice was so gentle it was worse than cruelty. The last thing I saw before the water closed over me was the double climbing the stone steps, keys clinking softly, carrying my voice and my face into the kitchen above. The next morning, the man who looked like me walked into the county clerk's office, dripping faintly onto the floor, though no one commented. He signed the final deed transfer with steady hands that left damp marks on the paper. "Elena," the clerk said, "everything in order." "Perfect," she answered, though her eyes lingered on the small puddle forming beneath his chair. When he left, the smell of seawater hung in the room long after the door had shut. That evening he stood at the tower, the dish turning easily under his touch. For the first time in decades, it swung away from the lake. Slowly, carefully, he angled it toward the town, where lights glimmered in windows and children laughed in their bedrooms. Through the eyepiece, he smiled with my smile. "So many possibilities," he murmured, "so many subjects." The copying process was complete. And now it could begin again. And that was the last anyone saw of Troy Miller. The man who signed the papers afterward looked like him, sounded like him. But the locals say something about his eyes was wrong, and the smell of seawater followed wherever he went. So I'll leave you with a question. If an inheritance like that came to you, would you risk living there for a year, knowing something in the water is waiting to learn your name? Let me know in the comments below if you're brave enough.